Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about body language and what are all the nonverbal components that help you get your speech across in a way that gets your audience to believe you, to feel your passion, and want to get behind you. It's what you don't say that counts. So what you see here are a lot of people in lots of different positions. Some obviously may be speaking, some might just be hanging out. But the point is that we as human beings tend to make snap judgments about people as soon as we see them. And the first thing that we see is someone's body language. So when you're standing up in front of someone, you have to be very acutely aware of what your body language is conveying, because unfortunately in our society, if we have a difference between what we're saying and how we're saying it, people always believe how we're saying it over what we say. Now, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but think of it this way. If we were in a face-to-face class and I came up in front of the classroom and I crossed my arms and my legs and I looked up at you and I said, "Boy, am I excited to be with you for the next hour and a half." Would you believe me? Of course not. You would see my body language, you would hear my voice, you would pick up on many cues other than what the words are that I'm choosing to decide that what I'm saying isn't actually what I'm believing. And so what you want to make sure of, the way I think about it, is you want to neutralize your body language in a way that doesn't allow other people to think of it conveying something other than what you intended. So that's what I want to talk about over the course of this session, is how do we make sure that we use body language to amplify and help our message and not do anything to make people infer something that wasn't intended. Physical delivery skills. So you have all these different nonverbal communication techniques that you can use when you're delivering a speech. Appearance is a big part of it. We perceive people in terms of what they look like and how they're dressed, and we make decisions. So that's something you have to consider. Eye contact. People often talk of this as the cornerstone of good communication. Facial expressions can convey a lot of information. Your gestures, your hands, what are you doing and how is that helping or hindering your message? Movement, are you standing still? Are you walking? And what does that mean? And lastly, posture. Now, I want to pause here to say that in communication, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to nonverbal communication. I will not say, you have to do this, and if you do this, you'll be successful. Or if you don't do this, you're going to fail atrociously. Because life just doesn't work that way. The way I think about it is that it's always thinking about the risk versus the reward of a particular act or behavior when you're speaking. So I always ask myself, if I'm doing this with my hands, is this going to potentially get people to think of it as being something other than I want? If I cross my hands in front of me, how might that be conveyed? If I speak like this, all monotone, what might be the perception of me? And in that, I start to decide and make choices about how I want to come across. Good communicators are conscious communicators. We're conscious of the decisions and choices that we make to communicate and convey our messages in the way that we want so that we get the desired effect from our audience. So firstly, appearance. You see here a woman on the left and a man on the right, 6 vignettes of the same person dressed very differently. Now here's the tough truth, and I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. We as a society make snap judgments. In fact, one might even say we stereotype people. And there's always a question of how do we balance being ourselves with managing our image, and where is that balance? So if you think about it, depending on the situation, how do you want to come across? Maybe you say, this is my identity, and this is how I dress, or this is how I look, and therefore this is how I'm going to appear. And again, remember that risk versus reward. You might say, it's worth the risk that somebody's going to say, I don't like you. And if that's worth it, then by all means do it. But there are other situations where maybe it's a little bit harder to make that decision. Think about going to an interview. How often do we balance a little bit of how we want to come across in quote unquote real life with how we know we need to come across in that situation in order to make the desired effect to get the job that we're interviewing for. So it's always this push and pull of trying to think about who am I and how do I want to come across with the image that we want to convey. I will also tell you that a lot of times how we perceive ourselves, not just how other people perceive us, is also about how we come across to ourselves. There was a famous study that had a group of people dressed in white lab coats taking a math test and another group not wear the white lab coats. And what they found is that those that were wearing the white lab coats ended up being more accurate. Why in the world would that be? Well, because we tend to associate white lab coats with doctors and people in authority that are very meticulous at what they do, and that transfers to how we perceive ourselves and in turn how we come across. So when you're making a decision about how to come across, consider that if I come in dressed more professionally, I might feel more professional than if I come in with jeans and a t-shirt. But again, it's always a choice that you have to make. That balance between who am I and how do I come across, and how do I come across in terms of appeasing the audience and the perception that they may have of me. Eye contact. I mentioned earlier that it's the cornerstone of good communication. In the Western world, there is nothing positive that we associate when somebody doesn't look at us. Whether we're listening or the listeners or the speakers, if somebody doesn't look at us, we think they're lying, they're disinterested, they're nervous, they're hiding something. It's never something positive. So being able to look at people when you speak shows a lot of confidence in how you're coming across. And it has a lot of additional benefits as well. Part of it is it helps manage your nerves, which sounds counterintuitive because we've all heard these ridiculous things like, well, if you get nervous, just imagine the audience not dressed, or just look at the top of their heads, or look at the exit sign towards the back of the room. None of these things are going to help you form a connection with your audience. And that's really what good public speakers do, is form a connection with their audience. So why then would I say that it helps manage your nerves? Well, because I'm guessing that when you're speaking with your friends, you don't worry about looking them in the eye. And good speakers are the ones that act in general, maybe a little bit more polished, as the same person that they would act in a non-speaking situation under stress. So just look at your audience will make it feel like it's a normal conversation. It also helps you to concentrate. A lot of times if we're not using eye contact, we tend to be flittering all around the room and looking at lots of different people, or looking up and looking down, and that keeps us from being able to concentrate on what we're trying to say. If I'm just looking at one person at a time and really getting that eye contact down, then I'm much better able to concentrate on my message. It helps us to avoid distractions. A lot of times when we're in this mode where we're looking at lots of different people and not really focused on the audience and looking at them, any change in the environment is going to make us distracted. Maybe somebody comes in the middle of the speech, or somebody's phone goes off. It will keep us from being able to stay concentrated and focused on what we want to say. It will also reduce our filler words. How many of us have heard people that say like, kinda, you know, sort of, actually, basically? There are so many out there. The problem with filler words is that it keeps you from sounding more confident. It makes it seem as if silence is something that you're not comfortable with. And one of my mantras is that power is never rushed. So don't be afraid to take those pauses. When you do, instead of using filler words, you will allow silence to fill the room, and those couple of seconds will allow you to think about what you want to say next. It'll allow your audience to process what you've already said, and it will help you all get your message across in a better way. It also helps to pace yourself. If you're looking at people in the audience and you're really focusing on one person at a time, you are going to speak more fluidly, more cogently, the way that you normally would, rather than speaking inside your head and being less present. You can relate to your audience more. If I don't look at my audience, I will have no idea how my message is being perceived. If I look and I see somebody looking confused, then I can make the decision in the moment to maybe go over some information again. Or if I look out at my audience and I see everyone seems a little tired, maybe I can amp up my energy, or maybe I can give people a break. But the point is that if I'm not looking at people, I won't be able to make those judgments in the moment to cater to my audience's needs. It also helps you to project gravitas. Gravitas is a sense of power and authority. And when you look at people in the eye, it shows that you are not afraid, that you believe what you're trying to say, that you're confident in saying it, and that you're passionate about it. If your eyes are flittering up and down and all over the place, it makes you seem as if you're not quite as confident in what you're trying to say. And of course, you can gauge the audience reaction. We talked about this a little bit under relate to the audience. If you are looking at people, you're forming a connection, and that's really what public speaking is all about. I'm going to show a short video to show you how using filler words can really mar the experience that your audience can have when you're speaking. This is a very brief capture. We're not going to watch the entire thing, of Carolyn Kennedy, who was the daughter of the former president John F. Kennedy, giving an interview in New York. It was a longer interview, and these 5 minutes and 38 seconds were spliced together to show the impact that constantly using filler words can have on the audience. We're just going to watch about 30 seconds to a minute.
You know, let me begin this way.
It was a few years ago, after, I felt, my job was to reach out to, everyday New Yorkers, and really, I really ought to give it some thought. This is my life, as a
Working
mother.
with New York City.
While I was thinking about it, just sort of, in my own head, and saying, why don't you be senator? You'd be great. Go for it. We're rooting for you. On the subway this morning, people were, coming up. So,
if you're somebody who uses filler words, what you want to do is practice good eye contact, pausing on one person at a time, giving them a full thought, and being watchful of your own habits so that you can change them. I used to say like all the time when I was in high school. I went to high school in Northern California. We actually invented the term like before it spread like wildfire across the rest of the country. I didn't even know it. I wasn't even aware of it because I didn't always concentrate on how I was coming across with my own speech. And it wasn't until college that I was made aware of how much it had an impact on the way I came across. Facial expressions are another piece that people don't always consider when we're thinking about nonverbals, but have a huge impact on the way that people can come across. You want to practice being expressive. The gentleman on the right is practicing all kinds of different facial expressions. Now, I'm not saying that when you're going up to speak, you might be using all of these. That might be a little strange. But it is important to practice being expressive so that when you are speaking, you have the ability to do so. This is actually what actors do. They stand in front of a mirror and they practice looking sad, looking happy, looking confused, looking surprised, looking scared. Because sometimes we just need to use and get used to using those facial muscles so that we can become more expressive in our face. One of the things you also want to make sure of with your facial expression is to use a real smile that comes from the eyes when you want to smile. I'll get back to that in just a moment. So there are lots of different smiles. I think there are 17, but don't quote me on that. But there's only one real smile, which is called the Duchenne smile. And you'll see that the girl in blue who just won gold is using that smile. She has a real smile that is lighting up her face. Her eyes are smiling. Her entire expression looks happy. Look for a moment at the girl to her left who won silver. That is not a real smile. She has a forced smile that says, I know I'm supposed to smile because I got silver, but really I'm just angry I didn't get gold. So make sure that if you are going to smile, you have a real smile. The other thing I will tell you, if any of you have ever heard, and I'm always sad to hear how many people I speak to that say, oh yes, I've heard that. If anyone's ever said to you, you should smile more, please ignore them. You do not owe a smile to anyone that you don't want to smile to. You are still capable of being extremely expressive when you're speaking, in your face without having to smile. If you do want to smile, do. It's a great way to connect with people. But if you don't want to, please don't feel it necessary to. You don't owe that to anyone. And make sure you don't overdo it. Obviously, the gentleman over here on the right, if you do it too much, can come across as a little disingenuous or a little strange. The other thing I want to talk about is gestures. Gestures are, what do we do with our hands? It's probably one of the things I get asked most often. What do I do with my hands? We never worry about it in day-to-day interactions when we're talking to our friends or our colleagues, but all of a sudden you get put in a situation where you're in front of a group of people speaking and they become like these giant appendages that you don't know what to do with. So I want to talk about what are the things that you want to keep in mind as you consider what to do with your hands. I love this quote by Albert Einstein. Of course, he wasn't talking about it in the context of speech, but in the context of physics. But in speech, it amounts to the same thing. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. This is important to me because when you get up in a stressful situation to speak in front of others, whether it's to a crowd of 500 people or to somebody you're interviewing with one-on-one, you will be nervous. Of course you're going to be nervous. If you weren't nervous, then I would worry. But what you want to do is make sure that you channel that nervousness non-verbally into something that's going to help you and not something that's going to hinder you. If you don't use your hands and you try to trap all that energy, it's going to come out in ways that aren't always as successful. If you've ever watched somebody speaking and you see them somewhat dancing around the stage or swaying side to side or doing lots of other things that can be distracting or can come across as less confident, it's because they're not using that energy in a way that helps them convey their message. What I want to do is show a very brief video of a gentleman talking about something. And as you watch it, at the end, I'm going to ask you, what was it about the way that he came across that made him seem confident?
Proceeding to develop a line of automation products that establishes new standards for quality, technological leadership, and operating excellence. With customer success as our primary focus, work has been proceeding on the crudely conceived idea of an instrument that would not only provide inverse reactive current for use in unilateral phase detractors, but would also be capable of automatically synchronizing cardinal gram meters. Such an instrument comprised of Dodge gears and bearings, Reliant electric motors, Allen Bradley controls, and all monitored by Rockwell software is Rockwell Automation's Retroencabulator. Now basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it's produced by the modial interaction of magnetoreluctance and capacitive diractance. The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panametric fam. The lineup consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes, so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the normal Lotus O deltoid type placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator. Every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible Tremi pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the gram meters. Moreover, whenever fluorescent score motion is required, it may also be employed in conjunction with a drawn reciprocation dingle arm to reduce sinusoidal depleneration. The retroencabulator has now reached a high level of development, and it's being successfully used in the operation of Milford trunnions. It's available soon wherever Rockwell Automation products are sold.
Now, before we get into what that was all about, did he come across as confident? And what about him made him seem confident? Even though you had no idea what exactly he was talking about, he used gestures in his hands in such a way that made you feel that what he was saying made sense. Now, here's the good news for those of you who are thinking, what in the world was that about? That was about absolutely nothing. He spent 2 minutes talking about utter nonsense. But because he used his hands and there were specific gestures that he used that made it seem like what he was saying was valid. Now, please don't go thinking, well, I guess it doesn't really matter what I say as long as I have good gestures to go with it, because of course you also want your message to make sense. But it shows how important it is to make sure that the way you use your hands can go a long way in making you come across as more confident to your audience. So let's talk about different pieces of that. So when you think about gestures, there's two things that people tend to use: emblems and illustrators. Emblems are speech independent and culturally learned, and illustrators are speech dependent and demonstrate words. So what is the difference? Basically, the way I think about it, or I want you to think about it, is that if you use a certain gesture within the context of a culture without any words at all, people will understand what it means. So if you look at the girl rolling her eyes on the right, she doesn't have to say anything. You know exactly what that means. If you see someone putting their finger up to their mouth as if to say be quiet, you will know what that means without having them say anything. If you see somebody shrugging their shoulders, maybe that means something, or nodding their head. So there are lots of things that are speech independent that people can understand. When it comes to your speech, you can use both, but the most helpful ones are the illustrators. What this means is that when you're speaking, you use gestures to show exactly what it is that you're trying to talk about. Now, you can't see me, and if I were just saying, I came in on Monday and I had a ton of emails in my inbox, and little by little over the week I went through them, and by Friday they were all gone, but over the weekend I got so many more messages, but by Monday morning we were back to where we were the week before. Sure, that made sense. But if I use gestures to show, maybe when I talked about my email inbox, I made a sign of something being really big, right? And then as I say going through, I start to use my hand to go down as if I'm getting rid of emails. Studies show that you'll be better able to remember that story because you associate it with gestures. So there are what I like to call generic gestures, which are the ones that you just use all the time to get that energy out. But the ones that are really helpful are those specific gestures that can help you convey the story. So if you're using the word one, saying one. If something's big, showing that it's big. If you're talking about directions, showing the direction, are ways to help your audience understand what you're saying and you to use that energy more productively. Couple of things about gestures that I want you to think about, especially for this class, but in general, is if you can think of nothing else, please try to keep your hands from touching. Now, why would I say that? Because oftentimes, any times our hands come together, whether it's the gentleman here that has them on his waist or the gentleman there who's putting his fist in his mouth, whether you're crossing your arms, whatever it is you're doing, we are doing what's known as protecting our core. Our core is our stomach area, and we tend to put our hands there because we're feeling nervous, we're feeling exposed, we're feeling like, conspicuous, if you will. So if you don't let your hands touch, while it's going to seem difficult and uncomfortable at first, it's going to make you come across as more confident. What it's going to tell the audience is, I don't need to protect myself. I'm going to show you that I'm so confident that I can just be here, stand still, use my hands, and convey my message to you, and I know that you're going to take something away from it. Now, of course, if it's appropriate for the speech, then you can do that. So in this example, when President Obama put his hands together in a gesture of prayer, that's okay. You can do that. If you're trying to, if you're using a story where you're talking about bouncing a basketball and you're putting your hands together to show that, that's fine. Just make sure that when you're done with that particular story or gesture, that you allow your hands to come apart again. I also want to briefly talk about movement. Now, obviously, even though you see the picture here of somebody running, when we're talking about speech, it's not quite something that dramatic. But a couple of things to keep in mind with movement. Try to avoid pacing. Now, I know this sometimes can be controversial because some people say, oh, but I know somebody who moves a lot when they speak and it helps them come across as more engaging and more passionate. And I'm not going to say that that's not true. There are certainly examples of people who can move and can do it well. What I will say is that the ability to stand still and be grounded, which is what you see in that third bullet, is something that shows power. It's something that shows confidence. So if you're thinking about pacing or moving around, the question that I will ask you to think about is this. Am I moving because it's helpful to my audience in some way? Or am I moving because it helps me get rid of nervous energy? If it's the first one, then by all means move. But if it's the second one, and you have to be honest with yourself when you're answering that question, then try to curtail that movement to stay grounded and use your hands and your facial expressions and your eye contact to come across with all that confidence. And lastly, posture. You want to come across as open and relaxed and energized, certainly not too straight or too stiff. Some things to be aware of. Sometimes people tend to sway a little bit because they get a little bit nervous and they sway back and forth. So just like with a movement, when you think about your posture, try to keep your posture to be open and relaxed, but not with a lot of movement that goes along with it. We've talked a lot about different pieces when it comes to all of these nonverbal communications. If you remember on the first slide, I had a picture of all kinds of people and it had these ideas of what that body language could be conveying. Maybe if I cross my legs, I'm lying. Maybe if I cross my arms, I'm uncomfortable. And it's easy sometimes to think about trying to consider what people's different body language messages mean. It's much easier to just neutralize it so that nobody can think anything of it. There's one particular thing that people can think about with 97% accuracy. What that means is if I ask you, was that person coming across as comfortable or uncomfortable, 97% of the time we can be accurate in what we think about that. That's it mostly about body language, which means that if I'm crossing my arms, chances are that people might misinterpret it. I might be doing it because it makes me feel comfortable, but people might interpret it as being cold or defiant or aggressive or closed off. So you want to be aware of all these different components of body language so that the only thing that matters at the end of the day, the only thing that comes across at the end of your speech is that your message was clear, it conveyed what you wanted it to convey, your audience felt that it was worthwhile, and that you said it in a confident way.